there were stages to the day. That was like in the first 3 hours, and the last 2 hours, they just wanted to get the hell out of that place. So, but now I'm getting back into that. Enough about me. So, is there a particular point of departure that we're interested in? Anybody want to bring up anything from last time? I know Ed wasn't here, and Bara wasn't here. So last time we were really worrying over the question of, strangely enough for being in a literature class, the mind-body distinction. And we looked at a poem by John Donne, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, very, very briefly. But we looked at that to see in a place, to find a kind of, maybe we would call it a benchmark. And I think in a way Donne is a kind of benchmark. A benchmark for a certain kind of thinking that resists the mind-body distinction. Now, Donne came before the philosophical innovations that really concretized or made really culturally present and solidified this mind-body distinction. He lived before that. But he was also, and this is to invoke not a philosophical perspective, but a religious perspective. Really, the Catholic universe, and this is very much a shorthand, but the Catholic universe is essentially binary, meaning there's spirit, there's body, and spirit, or spirit and letter. I'm sure this is an oversimplification, but to some extent, Donne and I think Donne and the other great readers of the 17th century, and by that I mean Donne and Milton and Shakespeare and Rembrandt, the great readers of this period saw the world in a way which was very, very different than that had been inherited from that Catholic universe, and which would also be very different from the world that became the legacy of a philosophical world. And we're just putting those figures, Donne, Milton, we've done together, some of us, Shakespeare, we've done together, some of us, but Shakespeare's so difficult because elusive. I mean, Donne is explicit in ways in which Shakespeare isn't, and we'll talk a little bit more about Donne today on the way to think about the way in which this question of the relationship between mind and body, or spirit and body, why should we care? Why should that make a difference? I think by the end of our last session, we had felt why it should make a difference, and that the alternatives that the philosophical world bequeaths, and in a way, we went through them very quickly. We labeled one Spinoza and another Hobbes. The legacies that the philosophical world bequeaths is one of total mechanism, or total materialism, and where spirit is no place to be found, that's Hobbes. And then Spinoza, which is somehow matter and spirit are together in a way, or identified in a way. Now, we saw both of those are highly problematic for political and theological reasons, right? I mean, Hobbes obviously is explicitly the philosopher of power, and he is the philosopher of power because there's nothing in the material world to salvage it. Milton, I think, he occupies the same world as Hobbes does to a certain extent, meaning everybody is worried about the terrors of materialism. Everybody, right? That maybe God is not present. But Milton, some of us remember, talks about this idea of right reason, that through reason there is your reason. When Milton thinks of Tselem Elohim, or the image of God, he thinks man is reasonable in the way that God is reasonable. So that kind of redeems the Hobbesian world. Hobbes has nothing there, right? So the question is how to put something there without turning the whole thing into spirit. That's Spinoza. And Spinoza, as we said, pointed this out last time, that's also a problematic perspective, because if you're trying to build a political realm which is stable, and if you have in mind all of those very, very bad memories from the middle of the 17th century, the bad memories being revolution, the bad memories being all these fundamentalist guys running around screaming, God has spoken to me, and then acting on it, and then killing the king. If you wanted to push away from that kind of what they called enthusiasm, which was the source of the trauma, well, it's going to be difficult if you embrace that Spinozan view of the world, because the Spinozan view of the world will give power to the people, really. And so on a political level, it undermines hierarchy. And on a theological level, it makes the problem can become that man himself becomes so divine that God becomes irrelevant, right? That the creation itself becomes so divine that the creator gets pushed off. So both of those were unacceptable philosophical solutions. And here, let's just look at, I did some slides from last time, which we never looked at. Slides are always fun, right? I'm pretty sure this is from, I think this is from Descartes. I'm pretty sure that Descartes Descartes called dogs robots. Now, he didn't have robots like we have, and it's hard to understand what he meant by a robot. I mean, but as we said last time, even at the beginning of the Leviathan, Hobbes refers to man as a machine. And I think this image, which I just pulled off the internet, is an image of the dog dissected, who somehow, according to Descartes, doesn't experience pain or something like that. The details are really not so important, but you can see in the Cartesian dog this idea, or the Cartesian dog as robot. I was wondering if any philosophers have dogs named Descartes, right? The revenge of the dog. What's important for this for Descartes is there is no spirit located in the animal, in the physical. Even a dog is considered, from Descartes' perspective, a robot. Right? Whatever is going to rescue man, dog doesn't have. And what does rescue man is kind of I don't know if it's a philosophical joke. I'm really not even sure. Descartes believed that this is a part of your brain, apparently. Any neuroscientists here? Descartes believed that the soul and the mind and the body came together in the pineal gland of the brain. So if you're looking for the place in which mind and body come together, I'll show you. It's in your pineal gland. I don't know if that's a philosophical joke or not. I mean, I would say it is a philosophical joke, but there's so much at stake for Descartes in making the claim. Because without the claim, he's Hobbes, and he doesn't want to be Hobbes. I mean, he doesn't have, his world of the human is not mechanical. It's saved by the soul, as it were. So I guess a general question, and this is one of the things we were talking about, is how does poetry survive science? Now, of course, poetry has survived science because people have been writing poems for the past few hundred years. But a certain kind of poetry, or certain claims that poetry makes, I think get to be more and more difficult with the advent of science. Does that make sense? I mean, I've made this argument so many times in so many different contexts that I'm not sure I'm either being clear or compelling. Does that make sense to people? Ed, what are you thinking, just so maybe we can clarify things a little bit?
What was the argument?
The argument is that when science is ascendant, it's hard to be a poet. Guess who's not going to be cut? Who's going to be the last to cut in the university budgets in Israel next year? It ain't going to be the STEM researchers, because right now, you tell me if I'm repeating myself, because I tend to sometimes repeat myself. But right now, as university budgets are constraining, we need the humanities less and less, because this is a time for pragmatism. That's the argument, right? When of course the argument is exact opposite. That, I mean, I'm not naive about financial constraints, but there is that sense that when we're in the situation that we're in, as we said last time, you understand with Hamlet that there is more to heaven and earth than is dreamt of in Horatio's philosophy. There's just more out there. There's more possible. There's a world that the Excel sheet does not encompass. And when scientists come along and say, dudes, right, we'll tell you what the world really is. We're not interested in your metaphors. And we still do live with that inheritance. I think that's the given in Western culture, right? It starts with Plato. Aristotle is a little blip, and you get the Greeks, which is a blip. Then you get the Renaissance, which is a blip. But the basic assumption is that poetry is useless compared to something else, whether it's compared to theology, whether it's compared to science, whether it's compared to philosophy. It doesn't provide insights. So you could see why that the threat of the mind-body distinction comes with it all sorts of other things which make poetry really just extrinsic. Ed, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to think about poetry not as separate from science, but in relation to itself, and thinking that poetry in a way found it hard to escape the establishment of the written word. So in the sense that the Reformation implied that you could get to faith alone through reading, and therefore through rationale. And I think Luther struggles with that. And I think that who
struggles with that?
First Luther, then Shakespeare, then Donne. I think they all do. But Luther saw the problem straight out. If you can get to the divine through scripture, it puts a lot of burden on language. And can language actually perform that function of delivering faith? I think that in some ways, the Cartesian logic and neoclassicism comes out of Luther's quandary and just emphasizes the rationale and attempts to ditch the problem of the spiritual, which is why the pineal gland almost looks like a joke, because it's like it's just.
It sounds like you might be writing your dissertation on this.
Sort of.
Right. No, you just covered an enormous amount of ground. I mean, I think going back to what Ed said, when we read Milton, were aware of that anxiety I think the first thing just to emphasize is, yes, the Reformation is a reformation into language. It really is, in some sense, a movement from image to text, right? They did not give sermons in Catholic churches. So there is an emphasis very much on word and language. I think I showed some of you a picture of a whitewashed church, and in the front is a book which is open wide. We looked at it together, right? So you saw the primacy or the priority of language or the word. And we saw with Milton the awareness, the burden of that, I think, just as Ed said, the burden of that responsibility. And Milton, he goes for it. He goes for it with, with constant qualification. Because as Milton has discussed, Milton spends an awful lot of time thinking about two things. One is the process of interpretation, and the other is the process of representation. How does a poet write? This is Milton's vocation. Milton is a teacher. That is his vocation, and he wants to teach in a way that's effective. So he feels that anxiety, the anxiety of language, the anxiety of poetry, but he takes it up. I wonder who else. I'd like Ed at some other point maybe to fill in that story, because there's a lot there. Now, the thing that kind of complicates it, and I want to go to Donne in a second, is, Newton is just a weird, we're going to fast forward. Newton comes much later, and I want to eventually get to this debate between Leibniz and Newton. Newton comes much later, and I think this is not a false thing to say, that Newton is the beginning of our modern scientific tradition, right? The Optics and the Principia, those two major works that remade the world, that made people forget Aristotle, which was no small thing, right? So he's at the beginning or he's in a way, he's a fulfillment of that tradition from 1660 in the Royal Society, but he's also the beginning of the way we look at the world up until you get to Einstein. And I think Newton is probably a little bit more intuitive than Einstein. So we're probably all in some sense still Newtonians. Meaning, even if we've never read Newton, we don't know a single thing that Newton said, we are nonetheless Newtonians. So he comes at the beginning of that tradition, but he also, and I found out about this when there was an exhibit years ago at the National Library. The National Library of Israel has Newton's, a huge collection of Newton's theological writings, which apparently outnumber his scientific writings by like 100 times. So Newton was very much, even from that, you know that he was not only part of the scientific world, he was part of Donne's world. He was part of the world, and we talked about this. We mentioned that perhaps it will resonate a little bit differently now. Newton spent time in his laboratory for 20 years trying to perform alchemical experiments. Why was he doing that? Because he believed, still had this belief, which you can trace back in its language to Donne, that somehow the world, as material as it might be or might seem, it can be transformed into something spiritual. You see why this is such a tremendous metaphor for poets, right? Alchemy itself is an act of creation, right? It really is a yesh. Newton wouldn't say it's yesh me'ayin. He would really say, going back to what Ed said about reading, is you need to find the right way to see the lead. And if you see the lead in the right way, you'll see the gold. So Newton is very much part of that metaphysical tradition. And even in his scientific works, there is the presence of electrical forces and gases and all of these things which Spinoza, who is like a orthodox Cartesian, like he doesn't want any mediating, he wants no mediation. And Leibniz just goes crazy with Newton. He says, don't bring us back 100 years. He says this about the great founder of modern science. But you see that in Newton is part of a story that goes back to Donne, goes through Milton, and I guess goes under, I don't know what happens in the rest of the 18th century, but for Newton, it's still very strong. Here is a picture of his map of the temple, as you can see, right? He was fascinated by the temple. And there were all these illustrations at the National Library exhibit. And he believed that the Holy of Holies, he kind of had that Harrison Ford movie view of the Holy of Holies. What's that? The Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Where it's kind of like this magnetic field thing. So Newton had that thing going also, that somehow the divine presence, when Newton says divine presence, it's not only the divine presence of theologians. It's like, it's with all of the new knowledge that he has. It's not like he stops writing this stuff. He writes this throughout his entire life. Here you see he knew Hebrew. See over here? This was Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Ve'olam Voed. So Newton was a kind of fascinated with the Hebraic mysteries that found their local place in the temple. There was a general idea in the 17th century as well. And some of the people we'll be reading wanted to peddle this, that all knowledge came from Moses. Everything came originally from Moses. And the Greeks learned from Moses, and so and the move that the reason people make that move is they want to look at science as something that is part of them and not something that they are outside of or outside of them. No, really, Moses knew it all. All knowledge is one. In a way, it's domesticating that scientific knowledge. Right? Even the philosophers, even the Greeks, even the scientists. It's a strange argument, but they made it. So fine. So I wanted to start with Descartes and Donne and just go through Newton to just see a little bit of what the stakes are here, right? And to see that Newton is still part of this older tradition. Hi, Alana.
Hi.
Hi, Janice.
I have a few things.
Good. I know. You have to tell me. As I told everybody, I was I've been dealing with my car at a garage for the past like 5 hours, so I'm not really sure what speed I'm on. I may be on like I may be on like the on the iTunes setting you can go at a double speed. I may be going at double speed. So if I am, please slow me down. Ilana, what were you saying?
For sure, this will slow it down. Um,
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking two things during this thing. You said about the university and what do the humanities have to offer, and
Right.
I was thinking that
Yeah.
I think it will be poetry that saves the earth and not science, because if the earth is just a material thing and we'll keep finding ways to survive, then we can survive with the earth looking completely different and much more bare than we can continue to destroy the earth and the web of life that's going on around here as we've been doing. And I think it's poetry that's gonna teach the appreciation and the beauty for its own sake.
Even that metaphor that you just used, web of life, right? That it's a bit that a scientist wouldn't use. A scientist probably wouldn't use that. Maybe a biologist would. Physicist wouldn't. Right. Right. So we're saving poetry. I want to do another share with you.
May I ask something
Please, yeah.
concerning alchemy? Was
Yeah.
alchemy perceived, whether or not people believed in it,
Yeah.
but say someone did believe such a thing was possible, was it
Mm.
not perceived as, in a way, competing with God?
In what?
In a way, competing with God?
Well, so right. I mean, so this knowledge, and Marlowe in his Dr. Faustus emphasizes the extent to which knowledge may have some kind of satanic powers or satanic forces, and there's magic all over that play as well. So there is a sense. So there are two perspectives on alchemy, aside from the people who were doing it, the serious people, and there were. One was, Ben Jonson writes a play called The Alchemist, and he's like a carnival barker. I mean, he's a cheat. He just steals money from people. He plays upon their desire, their vulgar greed. That's one version of the alchemist, and the other is, as you say, an alchemist that may be alchemy that may be associated with things that are dangerous, because magic itself is dangerous.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, well, I asked because if there is this Yeshmaian quality to it, it made me
but the assumption is not Yeshmaian. The assumption is somehow that Newton or the alchemist is going to activate something that is there. That's really the whole point, really, is not Yeshmaian, but God made the universe in such a way that if you see it and look at it properly, in a way, Shakespeare and Milton are guides to that, Donne for sure. If you see it in the right way, you'll see the possibilities that are there. They are there. I mean, and that's it makes what Ilana said earlier more interesting, and thinking about the relationship between alchemy and metaphor and how they're the same and how they're different. It's interesting. Yeah, you were in that, but I interrupted you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no, the next thing I was going to say is not that pertinent after what you just said.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say that again, going back to the fact that Dr. Faustus is set in Wittenberg, and
why is that significant?
Because Faustus is essentially bored of trying to learn things, and he finds the best way to the truth is through alchemy, which gets him to the devil, but it also gets him to God, because it gets him to hell. And so there's a strong connection between the classical learning of Luther and Wittenberg and the fact that to escape it through poetry and to get to God, you have to go through hell first, which I think then happens at the beginning of Hamlet again. But I think alchemy is as you said, it can be seen as a religious action, even though it's diabolic.
Right. So once again, Ed, you covered an enormous amount of ground there. I mean, I think it is important to emphasize that that Hamlet went to Wittenberg. Luther starts out in Wittenberg, right? So Ed is pointing out to the importance of situating Faustus in that context and the complex ways in which magic functions there. Yeah, Tikva, yeah.
Well, I wanted to say two things. First off, Milton talks about the danger of knowledge as well. This is one of the lines I actually underlined when we were reading it. When he's talking about, when the angel is talking about explaining the stars and astronomy to Adam, he says that God did wisely to conceal and not divulge his secrets to be scanned by them who ought rather admire. So there's this idea that man is meant to admire God's works as opposed to studying them. And I think
let's just stop there for a second. I think that's just a beautiful point you're making. This whole idea of admiration. I mean, it's a problem for Milton because Milton is an advocate of free will and certainly right reason. So I think God says to Adam and Eve, be lowly wise, meaning don't give up wisdom altogether, but don't forget your place. Meaning don't forget in a way. Milton demonstrates a kind of indifference to the Copernican and Ptolemaic versions of the universe. That's what Raphael basically comes down. Adam says, I want to know about the cosmos. What does it look like? And both of those are available. I think Milton clearly knew that the Copernicus one was authoritative, but the angel Raphael is like, makes no difference. Some knowledge makes no difference, as Tiff was saying. There is this sense of admiration. I'm not sure admiration and reading go against one another, but very, very nice, very interesting to bring Milton in like that.
A different point about alchemy for Ben is that I think the idea of the tree of life from Jewish Kabbalah was kind of stolen by mystic Christians at some point, appropriated by Christian mystics at some point, and I'm pretty sure that and Newton was deeply into numerology. And I imagine that through numerology, he ended up somewhere in the Kabbalah realm, and that's how he hit alchemy.
Okay, so, well, right, yeah. I mean, I think the takeaway from that is Kabbalah was one of these ancient wisdoms that people thought were cool, right? So you have a lot of Hebraists, Christian Hebraists at the time, who are interested in Kabbalah. And see the combination and see these things as somehow being part of a whole. But since it's summer and we've been talking so much about poetry, let's actually read some poetry, shall we? It turns out that this isn't poetry, it's prose of John Donne, but any prose by John Donne kind of qualifies as poetry anyway. Okay. Right. Can somebody just remind us of when Donne says here in Holy Sonnet 5, I am a little world made cunningly. What's he working with here? Meaning, if we read it completely out of context, we may have some idea of what Donne is trying to say, but knowing Donne's work and knowing Donne's context, can somebody explain what he means here, or what he's accessing here, or what he wants us to think here?
Can you repeat it, please?
I just want to know it's kind of like attention shoppers, attention people who took 206 with me, right? Who took the Renaissance class with me. I'm just asking what linguistic what languages are available to Donne such that this makes sense here. I am a little world made cunningly. We can read that out of context. It makes sense to us. I am a little world, I guess, right? Made cunningly by the divine. But for Donne, it means more than that. Remember? I guess it's summertime. Remember we talked about the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm? Right?
Is he before or after Shakespeare?
About the same time. Ed, about the same time, a little later as well, whatever, he starts, yeah. So what is the difference between—
They wouldn't be referencing, be referencing Shakespeare.
Probably not. When Donne or other figures during this period uses the term microcosm, what do they mean by it? What gets accomplished with that term? You know, I think of creative writing as well right now, and the way in which creative writers create languages for themselves. I'm just thinking, I'm not going to embarrass you here, Roy. I'm reading Roy's novel, his thesis. And there are layers of history to the place that he's describing. And I've read only the first 40 pages, and he hasn't done tons with it yet. But it's just like another set of possibilities that he's giving himself as a writer to talk about. It's the world, the linguistic world he's creating as a novelist. Is that fair, Roy?
Yes,
Okay.
that's fair.
Right. Okay. So with Donne himself is at the same time helping to create this world as a novelist would, but he's also, I mean, we haven't broken down into little private spheres. When Donne uses the word microcosm, it means something not just for him, not just in languages that he's developed, but that we'll see in all the other metaphysical poets, in Shakespeare, and in Milton. So when he says, I am a little world, what does he mean?
Is he kind of leaning into the idea that every man is a world unto themselves?
You want Donne to be Rabbi Akiva, right?
Oh.
You just turned Donne into Rabbi Akiva. Congratulations. No. Well, if I have the idea of a microcosm, which that in Hebrew is olam katan, right? So a microcosm presupposes, I think, a macrocosm, right? Can I have a microcosm without a macrocosm? I mean, I was going to ask, what is the difference between these two? Or better, how are the two related?
Could you say what a microcosm is and I missed it? No, I didn't say it. C. Rector Award winner, C, is now going to provide us the answer.
Oh my God.
On the spot. Yeah, I know, it's hot. You don't even have air conditioning, do you? You're perspiring. Okay, so yeah. I'm going to turn mine on.
I'm expiring.
Well, I think when I'll make it just because it is summertime, I'll make it even more fun. The world of where microcosm and macrocosm make sense under the heading of synecdoche, right? And the world we live in, or the world that science is going to create, is metonymy. So there's synecdoche to metonymy. Well, now I'm just being synecdoche. So there are different rhetorical tropes. I'm sure Dr. Feldman right now does not want to hear of this lacunae in your knowledge. But synecdoche is when I look at it as part and whole, right? Metonymy is part. They're just different parts. With synecdoche, there's a relationship between the part and a whole. It is a useful trope that I'm using right now in terms of this older Renaissance sensibility, when there is a sense created somehow through language, I think, through language by which we understand in every part you can see the other part. All parts are related. It's not like you just have separate, all parts. Remember.
That's the metonymy. Metonymy is all
No,
parts.
we're doing synecdoche now. Remember we said,
okay.
we read we read these letters by the letters of Lord Chandos, remember, and this is kind of this imaginary 17th century person before the fall when everything is still good, and he sees the whole world as being coherent, and at the end he sees everything as an allegory of everything else, because in that worldview, and one of the metaphors that's used is signature. God has signed the world. It's interesting that it's a linguistic metaphor. And if you just see the world in the right way, you can see the correspondence between the microcosm and the macrocosm. The microcosm really is a little world. It presupposes, it depends upon the bigger world. It only, and you know, people will say that the Israel is an olam katan, because you go and you see in Israel every aspect of God's creation, waterfalls, blah, 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 right? That's just, I'm using that example just as a way of talking about being able to see in the part the whole. So when Donne says, I am a little world made cunningly, he's relying upon us knowing that. I mean, as Tikva said at the beginning, it may turn out, as it often does in Donne, that Donne uses these metaphors first to assert an incredible sense of his own individual of his own self, but then he also erases it. Let's read something from what Donne titles as his expostulations. What's an expostulation?
To postulate, right?
Oh, I don't know. So what is an expostulation? Has anybody expostulated recently?
Like to speculate.
That's not how I understood it. I didn't look it up.
Negative connotation.
Pardon? You think it's negative?
To expostulate.
Oh, I just looked it up. It means to express disapproval and or disagreement.
Really? Is that it's always like that? It's always disagreement and disapproval? It can never be enthusiasm?
It's the only definition.
Ah.
So
do you have an opinion on this?
I don't know. I would have guessed that you postulate something and then the X is interesting because you can't intrapostulate or interpostulate, can you? So I think what you do is you set up a premise and then from that premise you develop something outwards.
That makes
exactly
more sense.
That's exactly what I would think. Yeah, what they had said.
Very good. Then you did amazing teamwork then, guys. I was thinking of an expostulation as, like an expostulation of insight, or I don't know, but maybe I'm wrong. But let's see what Donne does with this. My God, thou art a direct God. May I not say a literal God? A God that wouldst be understood literally and according to the plain sense of all that thou sayest. Just point out that the majority of Donne's work, of his written work, is in his sermons. He gave sermons every week at St. Paul's. And they themselves are this enormous literary work. So when we're looking at Donne as a prose writer, we don't expect things to be prosaic. But here, this is pretty straightforward. God is a literal God, whatever that means. He has to be understood literally and according to the plain sense of all that thou sayest. But thou art also, and here's a parenthesis, Lord, I intended to thy glory, and let no profane misinterpreter abuse it to thy diminution. What Donne seems to be warning us with this parenthesis. What's the warning?
The misreading of his words.
Right. Well, I'm guessing from the first line, God is understood as a literal God. Maybe he's going to say something which is not going to conform with that understanding, and Donne is giving us a warning by way of apologizing to the divine. I don't want you to think by speaking about you in this manner that I mean any disrespect. Thou art a figurative, a metaphorical God too. I guess we have to read the whole thing and then we'll go back. A God in whose words there is such a height of figures, such voyages, such peregrinations to fetch remote and precious metaphors, such extensions, such curtains of allegory, such third heavens of hyperbole, so harmonious elocutions, so retired and reserved expressions, so commanding persuasions, so persuading commandments. Oh, what words but thine can express the inexpressible texture and composition of thy word, in which to one man that argument that binds his faith to believe to be the word of God is the reverend simplicity of the word, and to another the majesty of the word, and in which two men equally pious may meet, and one wonder that all should not understand it, and the other as much as that any man should. Did I read that last part right? And one wonder that all should not understand it, and the other as much that any man should. There are so many interesting parts about this passage.
I looked up expostulate
So
in the OED.
Okay.
It means, give me one moment. Means to ask, demand, or claim, and with indirect, to demand how or why.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Those
Good,
are
okay, that's
obsolete now.
right. So those are different. Those are the OED is of course a historical dictionary. Great, thank you, Tikva. So let's just start out. There are two kinds of readers in the world, right? What are those two readers according to Donne?
the metaphorical and the literal.
There are those who take things literally, and there are those who take, or metaphoric, who will understand things metaphorically or figuratively. We have to explore what he means when he says a figurative or a metaphorical God. One of the things I think is really beautiful about this passage is the way that they both are considered by Donne to be pious at the end. That there are, that he's inclusive. And even though obviously he himself understands the metaphorical God, but there's still respect for that other God, for that other.
You know, Professor, it evokes the Gemara with like, Elu ve'elu, divrei Elohim chayim. You remember that?
Yeah, right. No, for sure. I was thinking, like people often say that the beginning text that children read when they start to go to Jewish day school, they may, when they get to first or second grade, they may read midrashim, right? And they get a certain kind of pleasure out of it, which, as we've spoken about, most people never graduate from that kind of pleasure, which is most people stay children all the time. But there are children, right? And I guess there are people who are literalists, but it's okay. It's okay. But let's talk more now about this metaphorical God. What does that mean? Whoa. Can somebody explain what that means? What is a metaphorical God?
Incomprehensible.
See, I was occupying my 21st century scientific perspective, and I thought metaphorical God might mean like, oh, God is just a fiction.
No,
but it's not that. But it's not that, right?
God is the metaphorical God is the God that leads us to wonder or awe about the universe. It's the God that the metaphor of God makes us. It's hard for me to explain, but it's not a literal God. If we read about God, destroying the earth in the flood,
yeah.
and you can take it literally or we can take it metaphorically, and
Right.
we can think about that kind of anger. We can think about starting over. We can think there are all kinds of different ways you can think about.
Okay. I'm just getting confused because a metaphorical God is somebody who expresses himself in metaphor or needs to be understood in terms of metaphor.
What's the difference between those two things?
Well, because
Yeah,
what's
the difference?
I tended to think it's more the latter.
Because, what's the difference? The first is divine revelation, Donne is believing in divine revolution, and as Ed said earlier, the words carry a lot for Donne, right? So you have the divine revelation, a God in whose words there is such height of figures. So God himself uses metaphors. So Tselem Elohim, the image of God is, for Donne, is God works through metaphors, so we have to also.
Or in the inverse way, metaphors exist because that's how God functions.
I would say metaphors, that's how our brain functions.
Yeah, but same thing, right? So
I understood what Alana said. I didn't understand what you said, though, Ed.
So he's basically saying that language is so contradictory and rich and complex that comes from the Godhead itself. So while it cannot explain things literally, the figures of language and the metaphors of language are themselves divine. I think, but I think it goes back to be really boring. It goes back to, I think it goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas' idea of language.
Invoking St. Thomas Aquinas, that's very high on the boring scale, but go ahead, yes.
So it's anagogical, as in a bit like the microcosm, macrocosm. In order to understand all of the components, you get led towards a metaphysical vision which can't be composed of each individual part.
I hope I didn't insult you by that with the boring comment.
No.
Yeah, good. Most of you know me. We had a visitor last time, and I was my normal self, and she got offended.
No.
I was sorry.
I mean,
I told her, rightfully so, that I would be more thoughtful. So that was me being more thoughtful after not being thoughtful.
I think people need to understand that you need to be interpreted with metaphors. You know?
Well, thank you very much, Steve. Bara, what did you want to say?
Yeah, well, I was thinking that the focus also shifts. Like if you want to read all these, the figurative language in God's words, it is more you and your reading and your different readings and interpretations of that language. That is, you become, you are responsible for all the interpretations. And the text is, what you have is a text. What you have is a word. And then
the text we're talking about is the divine revelation, or of words, or the world.
I'm just thinking about this in relation to what we discussed, like the session before the one that I missed. It's the Bible and the holy books and religions and the text itself, which you cannot think of in different ways, in multiple ways. You think about it in one way, and to come and say that we have here a kind of like different stories and different readings and different a metaphor calls for different readings. It's not one thing. It's many things that you can bring into the text, and then it's you bringing your meaning and your reading into the word itself.
Right. I keep on going back. I would maybe inflect what you're saying a little bit differently, because I think good readings require a sensitivity to something that's there. Meaning, it's not the subject may activate that meaning, since it's my reading. But it's not just my reading. If it's just my reading, then I'm not interested in sharing it. I'm thinking more of Joseph and his brothers, and where the jailer makes the distinction between the fairy tale and the commentary, right? And the fairy tale, well, I guess the fairy tale for Donne is God. God's the fairy tale. But then right, and this is no, you don't go like, deconstruction crazy, you'd say midrash, or like they're all, atheists. The fairy tale is God, but the traditions, the commentary that surrounds the divine, the poetry that surrounds the divine, makes God divine. Or through our understanding. I mean, in a way, let's just go back. So let's just go back here. So I think here he is talking about in whose words there is such a height of figures, such voyages, such peregrinations to fetch remote and precious metaphors, such extensions, such curtains of allegories, such third heavens of hyperboles. I mean, he is talking about Revelation. So harmonious elocutions, so retired and so reserved expressions, so commanding persuasion, so persuading commandments. You see that chiasmus there? Commanding persuasions or persuading commandments. Oh, what words but thine can express the inexpressible texture and composition of thy word. Yeah, Roy, yeah?
Yeah, no, he's getting to the key point of that God is a metaphorical God because we can only understand him up to a point. You know, just like metaphor always tries to reach for something but never quite gets there. So of course, no other words but his could express the inexpressible texture and composition. Only his words can express metaphor for us, or we can only understand him through grasping for metaphor.
But it's also an invitation for. Isn't it an invitation for man to create metaphors? Oh, what word but thine can express the inexpressible texture? Oh, I see, and composition of thy word. Meaning, so that's the only thing that's available. I was looking at it differently, but this is because this is how I'm thinking lately, that this is actually an injunction to write and to describe the divine. This is a kind of apology for poetry. Oh, what words but thine can express the inexpressible texture and composition of thy word? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
Professor Scott, isn't the journey in this sentence from words to word, as in from the loose material we have to the divine truth at the end?
I see. So that would be, and that would be, and would that be just divine revelation, or would that allow, is he talking about poetry, or is he talking about language here, or just divine revelation here?
I think in thy word there is this divine truth that's embodied in the concept of the word, the logos of God. And what we have is lots and lots of words, and we're in a jumble, and language has fallen apart. But somehow he believes or has faith that by repeating the process of building on words and metaphors and figurative allegories, you get closer to that definitive word which we don't have, that logos.
That sounds good. That makes sense to me. Yeah, Bara.
Does that mean that also, like, maybe the poet can recreate the world through like imitating that process of using all that language? Then poetry and the poet can come close to the divine.
Well, so the Romantics are certainly going to make this argument in the 19th century. And Sir Philip Sidney kind of already does that in the 16th century, I think. But the way I read Donne, I think there's always a relationship between the one interpreting or writing and the thing being interpreted. And divine revelation, as Ed said earlier, there is the power of the word. I thought here that this is like an injunction to what I've been talking about for the past month or so, the injunction to Midrash, that the only way you can understand God is through poetry, through metaphor, through those things, through through those precious metaphors. Let's look at one more passage from Donne. We are going slowly, but this is fun. And we have
listening to something. 31. Nacha. I don't know. I don't know. Sorry. Bye.
Professor?
Yeah.
Is it okay if I ask Ed to repeat what he said about the logos?
Yeah, please. Wait, I have to unmute you. Take two.
Sorry.
Take two.
That must be even more boring. I think in the book of St. John the Divine, the idea is that through revelation, you can see God's purpose, and God's purpose is defined in the book of Revelation by the word logos, which in Greek really is another word for the word, which then goes back to to Genesis, the creation of the universe. So it's this idea that divine truth is encapsulated in the word of God, and yet we as sort of subhuman, we as down here in this mundane world, what we have is a sort of fragmented language that we use as best as possible to get to that eternal truth, that word, that logos.
The word, as language, does that take on special weight in our period? Meaning Jesus is understood as the word made flesh, which emphasizes much more the physicality or the non-linguistic nature. There's a kind of non-linguistic nature to the word, but what I'm getting from what you're saying is that during this period, the word is understood with all of the weight attached to language to which you referred before.
Yeah, I think, yes, and I think it draws attention to a very modern idea of language as being fragmentary but because they're not yet atheists with a fragmented language, they believe that there is still that truth.
How can you not be an atheist if you believe in a fragmented language?
Because their belief is that language is failure. It's a bit like, you don't not write history because there's no historical truth. You write history to get closer to that historical truth, and the process is part of reaching towards divine truth. Whereas I think now the failure of we see the failure of language as proof of that there is no truth at all, which is an inversion of how I think Donne would have seen language. He would have seen it as fragmentary, but in that fragmentation, you get a glimpse of God.
Tikva, did you want to say anything? Was that satisfying?
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to clarify I wanted to ask for clarification about what Ed said regarding the Genesis bit. So, I mean, there's basically God says things and then creates the world, right? So there's this idea of, so what you're saying is there's this idea of the word having the power to manifest reality?
You're doing a little bit too much rabbinic stuff here. I mean, you're just pushing it in that direction a little bit. I don't think it's meant in that way. I think the microcosm macrocosm thing that Ed is talking about is just more useful from that.
It's also different in Hebrew than in English. So in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was God. Is in the Geneva Bible and King James's Bible a direct reference to how they translated parts of Genesis. So it doesn't quite add up to how John Donne would have seen Genesis isn't exactly how necessarily.
Tikva, that's an interesting perspective. I thought you were going to go there, but let's just not go there because I think the way Ed explains it is useful for us, or is sturdy for us at the moment. Let's read one more passage. Shall we do that? And then we'll try to come back to the problems with which we started if we can. Okay. And so, for such a sight of God as we take the apostle to attend here, which is to see, this is Paul's letter to the Corinthians that he's talking about. And so for such a sight of God as we take the apostle to intend here, which is to see that there is a God, the frame of nature. The whole world is our theater, the book of creatures is our medium, our glass. And natural reason is light enough. But then for the other degree, the other notification of God, which is the knowing of the God, that though that also be first to be considered in this world, the means is of a higher nature than served for the sight of God. That's hard to understand. Somebody needs that. And yes, while we are in this world, it is but an enigma, an obscure riddle, a representation darkly and in part as we translate it. As the glass which we spoke of before was proposed to the sense, and so we might see God, that is, see that there is a God. Why this? Sorry. See that there, one more time. as the glass which we spoke of before was proposed to the sense, and so we might see God, that is, see that there is a God, this enigma that is spoken of now, this dark similitude and comparison is proposed to our faith. And so far we know God, that is, believe in God in this life, but by enigmas, by dark representations and illusions. That seems like a fairly important passage to try to understand what's happening in the 17th century, right? And of course, not everybody thinks like Donne, but he's bringing a lot of stuff together here. Ooh. I mean, both of these passages are negotiating the possibility of the presence of the divine in the world. It seems the first passage we read has to do with metaphor. Can we read this again? And so for such a sight of God as we take the apostle to intend here, I guess that's seeing through a glass darkly. You know that verse from Corinthians? What's the verse, Ed? Unmute, yeah.
And now we see through a glass darkly, but then we shall see face to face.
And now we see through a glass darkly, but then we shall see face to face.
It really means a glass like a so you know, it's my obsession, a shadowy mirror. So when you look at yourself, you don't see yourself.
Well, wait, it's a shadowy. Oh, it's a shadowy mirror.
So when you look in a mirror, when St. Paul looked in a mirror, mirrors didn't look like our mirrors. You saw a distorted shadow. And the metaphor is when we look at the world, we see the world in the same distorted, shadowy fashion. But one day we will see face to face.
I see. So the mirror is an unreliable media. For Francis Bacon, it was totally reliable. Right.
Yeah, but that's also a technological change because...
For sure.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean it's a technological change in the way they made mirrors?
Yeah. So the metaphor shifted. I mean, a mirror for St. Paul was a piece of tin. It was just like looking in a pewter cup.
So why is it that why is Donne comparing the world? The book of creatures is our medium, our glass, and natural reason is light enough.
Sorry.
The whole world is our theater. The book of creatures is our medium, our glass, and natural reason is light enough.
What is the book of creatures? Genesis?
No, the book of creatures, the world we live in. The living world.
It's a book. It's a book. Okay.
What does this mean? The whole world is our theater. So we think we're reading Shakespeare, but then we get the book of creatures as our medium, our glass. And glass is very different, right?
Is this metaphor not synthesizing the previous paragraph where he says there's a literal reader and there's a metaphorical reader? And he says when they meet, they're both equally valid, except he's being sneaky because what he's actually saying is I, John Donne, embody both perspectives at once, which is why I'm a superior interpreter to either the literal or the metaphorical interpreter.
Why?
And so
why is he above them both?
Because he incorporates both techniques of reading. He can do both at the same time, whereas they are equally valid but disparate. And so he says in this metaphor, there's a mirror, which is the natural light of reason, and that's one way to know God. But there's another way of knowing God, which is obscure. And you have to have both at the same time. And the literal reader doesn't understand the metaphorical reader, but I am incorporating it all.
Oh, so that's what he goes on to say, this higher form of seeing. But then for the other degree, the other notification of God, which is the knowing of God, will that also be first to be considered in this world? This means is of a higher nature than search for the sight of God. Oh, there's a distinction between the knowing of God and the seeing of God.
And between reason and faith.
And you see with your reason, and you have faith, and you know through faith.
Right. That's an obscure riddle.
And yes, it sure is, right? And yes, go ahead.
But the thing about faith is it's there. and because it's there, it's a sort of it's a piece of circular logic, right? You can't dismiss, John Donne can't dismiss his faith through rationale, so he has to approach his faith through words. I think, and the only way of approaching your faith through words is through riddle and metaphor and enigma and all of those parts of language that aren't literal.
Poetry, essentially. As the glass which we spoke of before was proposed to the sense, and so we might see God, that is, see that there is a God. Ooh, that's even better, right? You don't see God. I was wondering, seeing God, right? How would Donne say that? Donne doesn't believe in seeing the divine. But here he says, seeing that there is a God. So, and that makes it go along with the rational okay, right? Meaning, if you deduct from the world that you see, the creatures, the media, the book of creatures is our medium, our glass. So through the glass of the creatures and our natural reason, we see, we see in the creatures the presence of the divine.
So we don't see him, we just see that he...
No, you never, no, like Donne and Milton, you never see God. Never, 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 never. That's why I was confused.
But he also says we know God by enigmas, by dark representations, by illusions.
Right. Yeah.
Like the natural reason is like the science that is uncovering, what we know about the way the world works. But it's not enough, because the way to really know what's happening is with dark representation, illusions, and enigmas, or other words, poetry.
So the only way to know God is through metaphor. Is this referring? Donne's a poet. This dark, let's read the last part of it. As the glass which we spoke of before was proposed to the sense, and so we might see God. That is, see that there is a God.
So we don't need metaphors. We don't need metaphors to see that he exists.
Right. I guess so going back to our question earlier, how is Donne here negotiating divine presence? How is the divine present in the world? It's funny because God is all over this, but how is God present in the world such that you know that there is a God?
Through the design and when everything functions.
You sound like somebody. You sound like David Hume. It's like very 18th century. I mean, it's much more organic here. The book of creatures is our medium, our glass, and natural reason is light enough. So we go to the theater, and what's playing? The creation, and we see it, and from that we know that there is a director. Something like that?
And that's just the setup. Then it contradicts it.
Right. So how does God make himself present in the world there? And then just to go to the end and ask the same question of both parts. As the glass which we spoke of before was proposed to the sense, and so we might see God, that is, see the God that there is a God. This enigma that is spoken of now, this dark similitude and comparison, is proposed to our faith. And so far we know God, that is, believe in God in this life, but by enigmas, by dark representations and illusions. What if God's theater allows us to know that there is a God, what do these dark similitudes and comparisons, what do they let us know or feel or explore? Or they let us see, they let us know that there is a God. What do these things do, these dark similitudes?
Let us experience God.
They help us know. I don't know.
Yeah, no, right. Yeah, right. No, what you're saying is right. They help us know.
But what did you mean when you said that how do we see the existence of God? With the sight in regards to sight?
I think that's what I think as Ed read, explained it before, I understood it a little bit better. That we look at, which is to see that there is a God. So all of nature is the theater, right? Here's the theatrical metaphor. The book of creatures is our medium, our glass, and natural reason is light enough. I mean, Ed, if you thought this was like a conventional image from the Elizabethan stage, right, if it was a Ben Jonson play, a neoclassical play, as you like to call them, right, as soon as you get past the whole world is our theater, it changes completely into something else. The book is the book of, it's biblical. The book of creatures is our medium, our glass, and natural reason is light enough, meaning it's a whole different set of references that when I go to the theater, I see this medium, this creaturely medium, and from it I know through my natural reason, it's light enough. You know here that Donne uses the metaphor of light to describe the mind or reason. The light of the mind illuminates something that's there, right? Again, the mind is not only, the mind is neither completely passive, as Bacon would say, nor completely active in the way of creating a reality independent of what we call reality, but rather Donne's light of
Potent
natural
receiver.
reason. Right, Donne uses the term of a potent receiver. That's a metaphor that Donne himself uses in his sermons, the idea of the mind as both receptive and potent, doing both of those things at once. Right, so the light activates. So how do I know there's a God?
You can see the medium.
And reason, I guess.
I guess, right. And then there's this other kind of experience, not sight, but knowledge and representation, dark similitudes, dark representations and illusions. What do they let us, back to the same question, what do they let us experience though?
They actually let us experience the unknowing.
Partially. I mean, I think C maybe is, I don't know, it's like knowing and unknowing at the same time. I was thinking more about the Rembrandt paintings that we looked at and the way in which every angle that you can look at the painting, remember by the time we finished looking at the painting, it was like exploding off of the canvas. There were so many different perspectives. So every perspective that Rembrandt affords is both gloriously physical, material, and indispensable, but also, as C was just saying, I think it's not fully true. It's indispensable at the moment that we're looking at it, but it does not exhaust the truth. As Roy said earlier, metaphors just give us partial looks. So I don't think it's just the not knowing. I think there's the pleasure of the knowing as well, isn't there? I mean, I'm saying I get pleasure from dark similitudes and representations and illusions. Aristotle said so himself, right? And this lets us experience God. Weird, huh? I guess I'm just coming back to the question we started with last time: is what can language do? What does language do? It seems to do a lot in Donne, right?
There's this English poet who's at Gomble Keys in Cambridge and called J.H. Prynne, and he inverts this. He's really he goes along to the Royal Society and he listens to scientists using language to discuss mathematical ideas like multiple dimensions or relativity. And then he just chops up their discussion and puts it into verse. So he inverts it. And he shows that actually what they're saying is complete nonsense. And yet it doesn't in any way disprove, it rather proves their point. Because there is something eternal lying behind what they're trying to get at, but language won't get them there. That's it.
Can you just give us one more sentence on that?
Right, so I think the idea that, because I think it's an interesting way of synthesizing this idea of science and poetry, where he turns scientific rhetoric into poetry. by saying that science itself has become so anti-rationalist that actually listening to it through language doesn't disprove that it's true.
Why has science become anti-rationalist?
Because there is no way that a human being can possibly apprehend the things that science can prove. I mean, there's no way you can apprehend 32 dimensions. It's just not possible. And so he listens to them trying to use language to debate this point.
I see.
And he's not disputing that the 32 dimensions exist. He's saying, but we're getting back to poetry again.
Right, and 32 might not be 30, it might be more or less.
Okay, they might be more or less or whatever.
Right. Right, I'm just saying the metaphor is not precise.
No, and I think that's part of it, right?
Right.
You know.
Right. So what can language do then?
It can give you an experience of God.
I mean, there's something so physical about the poetry of Donne as well. And you see that language for him is not just it's not just a reference. I mean, it's for Donne language, I think Eliot said just this, language is a kind of form of experience, a form of experience, a certain kind of experience of the world, right? Is God present to the world or not? I keep on coming back to this question. Is there a God? How does God become? I mean, I guess we started with Descartes and that gang. How does Donne address the problem of God's presence in the world? How do poets do that? I guess it comes down to the question I asked you when we first read together a valediction forbidding mourning. Do they make it or do they discover it? Do they invent it or do they discover it? Remember, Dr. Johnson says of the metaphysical poets, they take the most heterogeneous ideas and yoke them by violence together. Right? They invent relationships that don't exist. But you know, that's from the point of view of 1775. But from the point of view of Donne and Shakespeare and Milton, they don't yoke by violence together things that don't belong together. There really is a connection between lovers and compasses, and the poet shows you.
So it's just seeing God is seen in the physical more than the obvious.
Strange, I don't know. Strange is. Well, we'll just end here. But is Donne even bothered by the same question as Descartes is? Isn't that like Descartes is, because of certain assumptions about space, I think largely, he has to like reconsider everything. There's the physical and then there's the non-physical, the spiritual. They're separate. So again, is Donne even ask? Is he coming from the same place? Descartes has to solve this problem. How do mind and body interact with one another? How do we save it? How do we save them so it doesn't fall apart into Hobbes? Is Donne not even asking the question in the same way? He doesn't have their question? I mean, he's earlier, that's for sure. Not by that much, but he's earlier. Does anybody want to speculate on this before C passes out? Oh, too late. He already has passed out. I blame myself. I blame myself entirely. So is there anybody who wants to talk about that?
he's not French, John Donne, is he? So he wouldn't.
You don't just get to say that as a British person, you know.
They have a different way of thinking about language, don't they? So, I mean, they're two very distinct traditions, linguistic traditions.
Say more so we understand what you're saying.
Well, the English language is uncontrolled, and you've got multiple origins, and it's a bastard language, and it's all over the place. And French is organized language, which is controlled from the state. So it's a different idea.
So poets have more of a chance in English than in French?
Like they do in Greek rather than Latin, yeah.
We're not going to send you to the friendship summit between France and Britain.
Years of chauvinism has been built in.
The British fought many wars against the Germans, but they really hate the French. That's the beauty of it, right? Sorry.
What was the bit about?
What's that? What, Ben?
What was the bit about Greek?
That Greek provides a better resource for poets than Latin does.
I'd like to see the paperwork.
Listen, anytime, you know.
Well, is it similar to how Hebrew is better for poetry?
I think no. English and Hebrew are very, very different. Greek, I don't know. I don't know enough about Greek.
I think Hebrew's
but you see that English proved to be a very good resource for poets. And so maybe for next time, when we meet again, we can think more about just this question about what language does. I mean, because Donne believes, for Donne, poetry it's obviously not something separate. It's very much not arts for art's sake. Poetry is part of a whole endeavor of thinking or reading, really. So poets and theologians and politicians don't become really separate people until the middle of the 17th century. And liberalism protects us all from each other. The death of liberalism probably means the return of barbarism. Because once you have the knowledge that different people actually believe different things than I do, right? That's what happens in the 17th century. Oh, you don't believe in the same, you don't believe as a Christian in the same way that I do. Then they fight wars all over Europe, the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 12 Years' War, the English Civil Wars. And, you know, John Locke and the American founders come along and say, the only way we can really protect ourselves from these competing theologies is by creating a public sphere where the theologies take back seat to, I guess, the political realm, the economic realm. We push everybody into the private sphere, which on the one hand is a very sad thing, because it would be nice if we could all, you know, have the same beliefs in the public sphere, you know, Bayit Yehudi's dream of, you know, whatever a Jewish state is. It's a nice fantasy, but it doesn't work in a multicultural world, right? It's not sensitive to the demands of that world where there are different truth claims, and liberalism really, you know, and now I'm being more the voice of doom. I was the voice of optimism 5 or 6 months ago. Without the limitations that liberal democracy puts on people, bad things happen. Right? World War I is really just the explosion of nationalisms. But so what happens, I think, in our century is the liberals come along, and liberalism is also born in some way in England, and just said we've had enough of that. So therefore we have to allow for different kinds of truth claims. And if you want to be a poet or an artist or any kind of religious person you want to be, do it, but don't do it in the public sphere. But that does not maintain for Donne. In Donne, we're in that world where part and whole relate to each other, and there is a macrocosm and there is a microcosm. That's also a fantasy, obviously, but it exists as a linguistic reality. I mean, it is obviously a fantasy. Eliot said famously that, you know, after Donne, a dissociation of sensibility set in from which we have never recovered. So that's Eliot writing about himself, probably, but it's also, meaning because he sees himself as a kind of Donne-like figure, but he's fantasizing about this world, this linguistic world that Donne represents. And in some sense, the languages that Donne creates do represent that, do create that world. You know, in the 80s, a whole generation of critics decided they were going to make their careers by proving that this whole idea of microcosm and macrocosm in the Elizabethan world picture, all of these fictions that are being used by all the authors we read, they spent their careers showing that they're really not true, that they're false, and we shouldn't focus on them because the Elizabethan world was anything but orderly. And they're right, the Elizabethan world was anything but orderly. But those fictions were the way a world was created. And it's really, it is an acknowledged linguistic universe. It's an acknowledged universe that is created by words. And which is to say that these, again, that these linguistic structures, they create meaning. And for Donne, it's a contained world. That world will break apart. That's what happens during our century. But again, I would like to come back to the question. I'm sorry I lost my train of thought there. It's just been a long day for me. What does language do? What does poetic language do? What can poetic language do? Do poets address this kind of question of the presence of God? He clearly is here. Right? But how is he answering the question? It's only through sight, through perception. Oh, that's how I see that there is a God. And what do metaphors allow me to do? To experience God? I think it might be that metaphors allow me to be part of God's world.
Well, I think basically every appearance of the word God in this paragraph could be simply replaced by the word meaning. And the general intent would basically stay intact. And
for him, God is the guarantor of a certain kind of meaning. So, but go ahead, yeah.
Right. So I mean, basically, we've been talking about the encounter of meaning through. I almost said the scientific method, but that would be historically, I guess, problematic. But you know what I mean, through scientific inquiry. Versus the encounter of meaning through metaphor or poetics.
I think
and both
go ahead, yeah.
Both paths, both roads can lead to, I assume, an equally great magnitude of meaning.
Right. I mean, I think what you said makes me think that the distinction between scientific knowledge and the knowledge that Donne is describing is scientific knowledge assumes a separate subject and object, and the knower in knowing, in a certain sense, defines the object, even dominates the object. I mean, there were many metaphors in the 17th century for the scientist conquering nature, masculine scientist conquering a feminine nature, imposing its understanding upon it. While I think for Donne, metaphor is a way to, well, let's go back, that the relationship between subject and object is different. That at some point, when the mind experiences, I mentioned this last week and I'll mention it again. I watched this symphony, the Berlin Philharmonic, and their concerts, as I think I said to you last time, they're more like events, meaning you don't sit as a spectator and just say, oh, that was good. You are part of that performance, which means in some sense that you became the kind of person that could hear that music. And in becoming the kind of person who could hear that music, meaning, so Tchaikovsky he's been expressing himself for 200 years, right? And this orchestra allows him, it's also complicated, to express himself. And as the composer, he wants to be heard. And here I am in the 21st century sitting and listening to this, and I become the kind of person who can hear him. We've been waiting for each other, right? And I think as great poets they're waiting for their audience. They're waiting to be heard. So when you do hear them, there is that sense of not that I just received something, I was part of something.
Yeah, I mean, basically you've arrived at poetics the moment that you don't have to prove anything in order to arrive at the meaning. Does that make sense? Like in science, you must prove whatever the conjecture is, or whatever the conclusion is.
Right. So good. I mean, you know, when proof comes in, it's like you see poetry is about to exit stage right. But there are other ways of talking about truth claims being valid without invoking proof or truth. Things can be likely or probable, meaning let's talk about, let's say, a critical reading of a poem. At a certain point, you might say, that's a bad reading. Why is it a bad reading? Because you have no evidence for the reading that you're making. Now, my reading may allow for other readings as well, but it's not that we commit disciplinary suicide by saying that poets do not have, or the humanities do not have criteria of truth. We do have criteria of truth. They're just different from the sciences. Because and they're different from the sciences because it's based upon a different kind of knowing. It only can be partial knowing. And seeing something as likely or probable, we might describe it as compelling. That's not a proof in a scientific sense. That's something that I say, oh, I see that. That makes sense. I see why that company decided to put on Shakespeare's Hamlet in that way. I see why the orchestra played Beethoven's Fifth in that way. I see why you read Hamlet in that way. I know those are disparate things, but I think they're parallel in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, right now in my thesis, I'm using what's called the cut-up method, where you write in a linear way and then cut the sentences into little pieces and then mix and match at random, and then go with spontaneous connections that the random mixing produces.
But you wrote the original sentences.
I wrote the original sentences, but I don't have control over.
You have partial agency in the process.
Right, but very partial.
So that's
and there's
yeah,
in the connections. But you couldn't call it a scientific route to meaning. You could call it experimental, I guess. It's kind of like
I mean, so Ben, you're obviously experimenting with a kind of intention, which is different from what I described as normative. I described as normative the author wanting to meet, right? And Ben is describing an aesthetic which is not unrelated to some 20th century aesthetics as well, which give up agency, or which are not interested in agency in the same kind of way. And I mean, Barr is writing a dissertation on 21st century novels, so there might be similar kind of stylistic choices that are made in relationship to intention and agency. So that's right. So I'm really talking. I'm a humanist, right? For me, humanists want to be understood, because for them their primary goal is teaching. Their primary goal is to teach. It's a different conception, right? So as I was saying, there is a poem by Donne where a very long poem, where he comes back to the metaphor again and again of being both a part of something and a partaker of it. To be a part is to be the object. To be the partaker is to be the subject. Now, Donne is interested in being both the part and the partaker. And that for him, I think, is a model of interpretation as well, that I partake of it. By partaking of it, I become part of it. I get pulled into that world. I mean, that's true of Milton's Paradise Lost. If you make yourself into a normative reader for Milton, And even if you're not a normative reader for Milton sometimes. And I think this is true of our experience of, dare I say it, great literature, where we feel like we're a part of it. And that's an unbelievable feeling. It's almost a religious experience. And I think really, I think that kind of reading, which we associate with the sacred, right, being a part of something and partaking of it, it's almost like the Eucharist. And Donne probably means to suggest that as well. But to be part and partaker, you can see why this recognition of a meaning that some author intends, and you're activating that, has a kind of sacred quality. The sacred quality is a sacred meeting, really, between author and reader. And it's also kind of, and since it's often creative, since it is creative by definition, it was going back to what Barra said with not all the emphasis, but it is creative by definition. So there's that coming together, that recognition, but recognition is also a moment of creativity.
Yeah.
Go back and reread Aristotle. Well, remember Aristotle says that recognition scenes are the most important things in the plays, right? Okay. Thank you guys for hanging out with me today. I appreciate it. Okay, I'll speak to you soon. Bar, I'll send you, we're going to meet in about 10 minutes, okay? Okay, bye guys.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Professor, let's go.
Oh my God.